Hello and welcome everyone to the Varsity Tutors Social Conscience Series, where all month long we'll be honoring Black History Month with a series of free, expert-led classes on all aspects of the African experience in America. And today we're fortunate to honor the life of Frederick Douglass, who was born 203 years ago this month, actually, and grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, which is why we're thrilled to have Ashley Anderson from the Maryland Center for History and Culture here to tell us all about the life and times of one of Baltimore's favorite sons, everything from growing up as a slave to becoming a freedman, an abolitionist, a noted speaker, and even a government representative overseas. So it's going to be a great program. Before we turn it over to her, I want to give you a couple housekeeping things. One, Frederick Douglass was known for a lot of things, but one, first and foremost, was his communication. So let's honor that by keeping this interactive. You can see the chat panel to the right of the screen is where you can answer questions that Ashley asks. And throughout the class, we encourage you to ask questions. And in the last 10 minutes or so of the program, I'll be collecting throughout all of your questions and interview Ashley with your questions so we can get as many answers as possible. Also, we want to make sure you get a chance to commemorate this and share with your network that you've taken some time during Black History Month to learn a little bit about Frederick Douglass. So have a camera nearby. And in about 45 minutes, we're going to give everybody an opportunity to take a selfie with Frederick Douglass. He never got to take one in his day, but that doesn't mean we can't take one with him right now. And if you upload that to Instagram, tag the Maryland Center for History and Culture and Varsity Tutors, you'll be entered to win a prize package that we'll tell you about right when it's time to take the photo. Destined to put a smile on your face. So with all that said, want to make sure we leave as much time as possible for Ashley and the folks at the Maryland Center for History and Culture to tell us all about Frederick Douglass. So Ashley, take it away.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. At least it's afternoon where I am tuning in. So as Brian said, I am visiting you from Baltimore, Maryland. And today we are going to be tracing the life of Frederick Douglass. First, a little bit of background about our institution. We just rebranded. We are formally known as the Maryland Historical Society. So maybe some of you are familiar with us. We are thrilled to be now known as the Maryland Center for History and Culture because we want to be more inclusive. We want to tell a variety of stories, and the story of Frederick Douglass and his life and his legacy are one of our favorites to tell, since not only is he one of the most famous Marylanders in history, but also one of the most famous Americans in history. So it is really exciting that we get to talk about him today. So I should mention, while we are the Center for History and Culture, we are also a museum located in downtown Baltimore. So if you all are in the area and it is safe to do so, come on down and visit us. But the best part about my job is the fact that I get to connect in digitally with all of you, and we get to discuss some incredible figures in history. So in order to talk about Frederick Douglass, we're all going to be historians today. So this is my job. I have a background in history. And as historians, we love to look at primary sources. So I want us to just kind of think about what is a primary source. So kind of noodle with that in your brain. Think about what the word primary means. Think about how this maybe connects with social studies and history. And a primary source, really simply, is a first-hand account from the past, which means someone lived a long time ago, they saw something, they experienced something, and then they documented it in some way. So we're going to go through a few examples just as kind of a warm-up to get our brains engaged, and we're going to discover some primary sources. Now, again, the coolest part about my job is the fact that I am connecting with all of you. Another cool part of this is the fact I get to show you items out of our collection without doing any residual damage to our collection by showing items over and over again. As long as they're digitized, I'm able to share them with you, and we're also preserving our items in our collection. So everything we see throughout this program does come from primary sources, most of which are from the Maryland Center for History and Culture. So we're going to look at our first example here. We have the original document here, and then it's typed out, so it's a lot easier to read. And I want us to start off by just kind of reading these excerpts here, starting with January 4th, January 5th, and onward. And the next thing we're going to have to do is identify what it is we're looking at. So in the chat, if you are able, type in what kind of document we think this might be. So think about what that thing is called when you write down the date, and then you write about your day, and you write down the next date, and write more about what you did that day. And while I can't see the chat right now, I'm sure it is blowing up with the idea that this is someone's journal or diary. And if you type that in, you are absolutely correct. And we know that this is someone's journal and diary and a first person point of view because, as you can see, they're using the word I. So I stayed home from school this morning so mama could go out. This tells us that someone is writing about their experiences firsthand. We also know that this diary is from the past, not only because the paper is yellowed, it's written in cursive, which is, I guess, a little bit of an older style now today to write, but the date is always going to be a dead giveaway. So this was written in 1881. So we're going to look through a few more examples of primary sources. Again, we have an original document here, and then it's typed out. So again, start reading this typed out bit. And when you think you have it, put in the chat, what kind of document is this? So that last one we looked at was a diary or a journal. So what is this we were reading? And I'm going to guess that a lot of people are putting a letter or a note in the chat, which you're absolutely correct. In this case, someone is writing to someone named John. And we know this is a first-hand account from the past because they're using words like your and you. They're talking about events happening in 1812. So again, the date is always going to be a giveaway to show us that it's from the past, and then you have to look for those clues that tell us it is a first-hand account. Now, it's not only documents that are primary sources, but items like this can also be considered primary sources. So again, in the chat, I want you to tell me, what is this whole thing? Like, edge to edge, what is this whole entire thing we're looking at called? I'll start off with giving us a hint. It starts with the letter P, and this is a picture or a photograph. So photos are also excellent primary sources. In this case, this photo is we're seeing women march for the right to vote. We can see this poster in the back says Votes for Women. So this tells us this photo is about 100 years old. We know it's old because it is in black and white, but we know that women gained the right to vote a little over 100 years ago now. So this photo is about 100 years old. Now I want us to think a little bit more about how we know it is a first-hand account, because we know it is from the past. So how do we know this is a first-hand account? So think about, what is that first step you need to take when you're going to take a photo? So maybe step one is get a camera. And then step two is going to be take a photo. So you have to actually be there in that moment to take a photo of something. So in this case, someone was there watching women march for the right to vote. They snapped that photo in that moment. So we know photographs are also excellent primary sources. It's also good to keep in mind that every selfie we take today, that is a primary source about our life. So someone 100 years in the future can look back at our selfies and learn about what our lives were like in 2021. Now, sometimes artwork can also be considered a primary source. So this is a painting of Baltimore City, and we know that this is a first-hand account because the artist sat on this hill, looked down into the city, and they painted exactly what they were looking at. So we know this absolutely is considered a primary source. However, with artwork, we do have to be very mindful because not all art comes from a real place. A lot of art comes from people's imaginations. So for example, if the artist had decided to include like a dragon flying in the sky, then we know this would be something fictional or pretend. But because we know this is a real place and we know the artist's process to paint this real place, it absolutely is a primary source. And then finally, artifacts and objects can also be considered primary sources. So just for fun, I want us to, again, in the chat, take a guess what this object is. And I'm going to start us off with a hint. All three of these pieces work together in some way. So type in the chat, what do we think this object is? And remember, all three pieces work together. Now, when I ask this question, typically I get answers like maybe this is used for artwork, since there's a brush here, but I'll let you know it's not used for art. Sometimes people guess it is makeup, but it is not used as makeup. It is not used for stamps or for archaeology, but instead, this is used on a person's face, but it is not makeup. So again, keep typing in any guesses you might have. It is not face wash, it's not like a face mask we would maybe use today, but this is a shaving kit. So this is something someone would use when they were shaving their face. So this is soap in a wooden box, this is a brush, and then this is a mirror. So whoever used this would lather up the soap, they would get it nice and bubbly and put it on their face using that brush, then they would use the mirror so they could see what they were doing while they were shaving. So by going through these primary sources, we were all just historians. We all had to figure out what it was we were looking at. We had to identify how we knew this was some kind of record from the past. And this is what we are going to continue to do while talking about the life and legacy of Frederick Douglass. So here we have a nice photograph of him as a young man. And we can kind of see down here, it says Frederick Douglass was born in 1818. So when we learn about somebody, it's good to start at the very beginning with his birth. He was born in the year 1818. So as it was mentioned at the top of this program, he is or would be over 200 years old if he were still living. And we only know for sure his year of birth. Frederick Douglass was born enslaved, and if people were born enslaved or if they were enslaved, records were not typically kept about their life. So birth dates, death dates, any anniversaries, any special dates to them were not typically recorded. So Frederick Douglass knew he was born in 1818. He knew he was born roughly towards the end of winter, maybe early spring. So as an adult, he chose his birthday, and he picked his birthday to be February 14th, which is Valentine's Day. That's because as a little boy, his mother would call him her Valentine. So this is partially why we celebrate Black History Month in February. It's also in celebration of Frederick Douglass's birthday. So Frederick Douglass is from the state of Maryland. So here we have a map of Maryland. He was born along the eastern shore. The eastern shore just means on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay here. And he was born in Talbot County specifically. And when he was born, like I mentioned, he was born enslaved. And this is unfortunately how enslavement in this country worked. If a woman was enslaved and she had a baby, that baby was also enslaved. So this is the world that Frederick Douglass is born into. He was raised mostly by his grandmother. His grandmother was enslaved for most of her life. She later gained her freedom, so she was able to raise Frederick Douglass as a little baby. And that's because his mother was enslaved on a plantation several miles down from where his grandmother lived. So she was not able to actively raise her child because she was forced to work on a plantation. So unfortunately, from ages about, well, newborn to 6 years old, Frederick Douglass didn't see his mother very often. If he did see her, it was typically late at night when she had expressed permission from the people who enslaved her that she could go visit her child. So Frederick Douglass grew up mostly with his grandmother. He also did have siblings who were also enslaved, but he didn't get to spend a lot of time with them either. So those first 4 to 5 years, like I said, he was living along the eastern shore with his grandmother. And then he would be later taken away from his grandmother to work along the eastern shore. I'm going to show us a quick video of just the landscape. There's not a lot of audio to this. You might hear some background noise, but while you're watching this video, I want you to pay close attention to the landscape itself. So in the chat, I now want you to type in what you noticed about the landscape. What did you notice about the landscape? As you can see, there are a lot of trees that we're seeing. We're seeing some fields here. These fields in the 1820s and 1830s probably would have been growing tobacco. Today, these fields are growing soybeans. So we can see this is still farmland even today. We have this sign here that directs us up this road. But otherwise, we're not seeing a lot of buildings in this area. We're not seeing a lot of houses in this area. So this tells us that Frederick Douglass grew up in a pretty rural area, and it is still, again, farmland even today. Now, when he was around 6 years old, like I mentioned, he was taken away from his grandmother, and he was forced to work on the Wye Plantation. So that is spelled W-Y-E, the Wye House Plantation. This photograph, I think, is really interesting because this gives us kind of a bird's eye view of this plantation. Plantation just means farm. So we have the two main houses here, this circular driveway. There are some smaller buildings surrounding it, and it looks like it is near some water. So as an adult, Frederick Douglass, he grew up and wrote about his experiences when he was enslaved. So we're going to actually take a look at some direct quotes from Frederick Douglass. And these are also primary sources since they come directly from his autobiographies. So we're going to learn a little bit more about his experiences when he was enslaved at the Wye House. So he wrote, "This plantation is situated on Wye River, the river receiving its name doubtless from Wales where the Lloyds originated. They are an old and honored family in Maryland, exceedingly wealthy. The home plantation, where they have resided perhaps for a century or more, is one of the largest, most fertile, and best appointed in the state." So there's quite a bit to unpack here in just these few sentences. So first, I want us to think about who the Lloyds are. So in the chat, just type in, who do you think the Lloyds are, using some context clues. And while you're doing that, the Lloyds, as we've learned, they are from Wales, so their family is from Wales. They are an old family in Maryland, they are honored, and they are exceedingly wealthy. And their relationship to Frederick Douglass is they are the enslavers on the Wye Plantation. And they are wealthy because, unfortunately, they enslaved hundreds of people, and part of enslavement meant if someone was enslaved, they were forced to work. They were forced to work with very few breaks, if any. They were also not free. They weren't given the same rights as people who were free, and they were not paid for the labor that they were forced to do. So the Lloyds would have enslaved people doing all the work, growing these cash crops. So like I mentioned, tobacco was a crop grown in Maryland. It would be sold for money, so hence the name cash crop. And then the Lloyds would keep all the money and not pay the people who were doing their work. So this is incredibly unfair. This is unfortunately not so uncommon in our country's history, with people being enslaved and forced to do work and not paid for that work. And we're also seeing that this plantation that people are working on is very large, it's fertile, it is the best appointed land in the state, meaning these crops are going to grow and grow, so there's going to be a lot of work to be done on this plantation. Now, it wasn't only farming that enslaved people were forced to do, and this is important to talk about as well, because enslavement didn't just come in the form of working on a plantation, it came in many horrible different forms. So we're going to take a look at another quote from Frederick Douglass describing some of the other jobs that enslaved people were forced to do. So Frederick Douglass wrote, "The home plantation of Colonel Lloyd wore the appearance of a country village. All the mechanical operations for all the farms were performed here. The shoemaking and mending, the blacksmithing, cartwrighting, coopering, weaving, and grain grinding were all performed by the slaves on the home plantation." So I like this first sentence. He describes the plantation as wearing the appearance of a country village, which really simply just means it's like a small town. There are so many people working on this plantation and so many different jobs that people have to do. It operates like a country village. And then we can see all of these jobs enslaved people were forced to do, and all of these jobs are highly skilled. You have to have a lot of skill in order to make shoes or be a blacksmith. I'm interested to know if anybody knows what a cooper is. I learned this a few years back, and I thought this was really interesting. So put in the chat your best guess as to what a cooper is. I should also mention a cartwright. That just means someone who builds carts that would be pulled by maybe some oxen or some horses. And a cooper, while maybe you guess this is something to do with animals or like chicken coops, a cooper is actually a barrel maker. So they would make those great big barrels. So this is a form of woodworking. So we're seeing these highly skilled jobs that if people were free, they would be paid pretty well for. But unfortunately, enslaved people were forced to learn these skills, and then they are again not paid for that work. Now, Frederick Douglass, he only worked on the Wye Plantation until he was around 7 or 8 years old, and then he was sold again to a family in Baltimore. So we're going to talk about his life in Baltimore, but not before I mention that the Wye Plantation is still, like I said, it's still farmland, but people still live there, the descendants of the Lloyds, and they are doing some incredible work to interpret and talk about the history of their family, about the enslaved people who worked and lived there. And they have, while it's a private residence, they have graciously allowed us at MCHC onto their property to talk to the people who live there, who are working to learn more and tell more about the history of this historic house. So we're going to hear from Richard Tillman. He is the current resident at the Wye House, and he's going to tell us a little bit more about how they are learning more about what happened there in that home on that land in the present day. I should also mention he has a really low, kind of gravelly voice, so it might be a little difficult to hear him, but we also do have captions.
If you can picture along the right-hand side of this lane, there were a series of buildings that would have been where the craftspeople worked and where many of the enslaved people lived. We know from archaeology done by the University of Maryland for approximately 10 years. They finished about 3 years ago. So in 2010 era, they dug up the remains of the blacksmith shop, which was right about where this large tulip poplar is. Those are easy to spot when you dig up the foundations because there's thousands and thousands of pieces of charcoal from the fires that they burn all the time to do the blacksmith work. They dug up a number of other buildings along here, and further down towards the end, they found what appears to have been a 2-story brick building, which we believe was used as slave quarters.
So as we can see, there's still a lot to be learned about what happened there at the Wye House, but they are doing some really interesting archaeology work in conjunction with the University of Maryland to learn more and to talk more about what happened in the past. So as I said, Frederick Douglass, he was enslaved at the Wye House for a couple of years. Then when he was around 7 or 8 years old, he was sold to a family with the last name Auld. Now we're going to just do a little bit of art analysis here. This is not Frederick Douglass. However, this man is enslaved, and he is enslaved in Baltimore City. And this is important to remember too. It wasn't just men and women and children who were enslaved in the countryside. People were also enslaved within cities. So this is a really interesting example to look at. So we have this enslaved man, and he is holding this umbrella over this woman. And I want us to think about, and maybe type in the chat, how do you think these two people are connected? So maybe what is their relationship? So it'll give us a second to analyze this image. And as I said, this gentleman here, he is enslaved, which means this woman is his enslaver. So this also brings up a really important point, that it wasn't just men who were enslavers, it was also women. So he's forced to stand out in the pouring rain and doesn't get to use the umbrella, but instead he has to hold the umbrella over the woman that owns him. What's also really interesting is the way he is dressed. You can see he's dressed pretty nicely. He's got this top hat on. And this is not because he maybe wants to dress nicely, but this is the clothes he's given by his enslaver to wear. So, like I said, enslaved people typically were not paid for their work. Therefore, they could not go out and buy clothing that they would maybe want to wear that would be, you know, to their taste or their style. Instead, they were forced to wear what their enslavers gave them. So this doesn't necessarily represent that she was a nice enslaver, because an enslaver is an enslaver. It is not nice to own another human being. But this is a way for her to outwardly show her wealth. She is showing she is so wealthy that she can dress people that she forces to work for her quite nicely. So this, again, is an example of enslavement within cities, and Baltimore City did have an enslaved population. Now, Frederick Douglass was part of that enslaved population as a little boy, and when he was forced to work for the Auld family, Mr. and Mrs. Auld had a son around the same age, so Mrs. Auld was teaching her son how to read and write, but she also started teaching Frederick Douglass how to read and write as well. Now, in Maryland, that was not technically illegal to teach an enslaved person to read and write. It was heavily frowned upon, however, and when Mr. Auld found out that Mrs. Auld was teaching an enslaved person to read, he was very angry. He told her to stop immediately, and she did. But now Frederick Douglass, he knew the alphabet, he knew how to sound out words, and he was trying to read anything he could get his hands on. And the moment he was able to read, he knew that that was going to be a key to unlocking his freedom. So his education would be incredibly important to him all throughout his life. This is why education is important today, because there is a lot of power that comes with being able to read and to write. And Frederick Douglass, he also wanted to share that knowledge as well. So as a child, he was also teaching other enslaved children how to read and write when he could. He worked for the Auld family for several years, and then as a young man, he was sold again and forced to work in a shipyard. So shipbuilding was a major industry here in Maryland, especially in Baltimore City. So here we have one of our harbors. So you can see all these little white dots in this image. Those are all sails of a ship. So we can see there are a lot of ships coming in and out. And Frederick Douglass was forced to work in this shipyard and learn how to build ships. So again, we're going to hear directly from him, from his autobiography, describing what it was like to work in a shipyard. So he said, "There was no time to learn anything. Every man had to do that which he knew how to do. In entering the shipyard, my orders from Mr. Gardner were to do whatever the carpenters commanded me to do. This was placing me at the beck and call of about 75 men. I was to regard all these as masters. Their word was to be my law. 3 or 4 voices would strike my ear at the same moment. It was, 'Fred, come help me to cant this timber here. Fred, come carry this timber yonder. Fred, bring that roller here.'" So we can see this quote goes on and on with him being called several different ways. I really like, however, these first 2 sentences. I think these first 2 sentences are very telling. So he said there's no time to learn anything. Every man had to do that which he knew how to do, which means he was just kind of expected to know how to build a ship and to learn on the go. As adults, when you all grow up and get your own jobs, someone is going to help you, someone's going to train you and teach you how to do that job. Frederick Douglass was not given that respect. He had to kind of learn on the go, and he was expected to just kind of know how to do these jobs to build a ship. He also had 75 people who could tell him what to do. So I want you all to try and picture like 75 people in your mind. It would fill up maybe a small auditorium. It's a lot of people. And now I want you to imagine what it would be like to have 75 people telling you to come here, go there, do this, do that. And then type in the chat, how do you think Frederick Douglass felt working in this environment? So here he is, he's enslaved all of his life up to this point. He is expected to know how to work in a shipyard, and he has 75 people calling to him. I imagine that would make him feel very stressed out, probably very overwhelmed, frustrated, and most of all, Frederick Douglass was angry. He was angry because he did not want to be enslaved. He did not want anyone else to be enslaved. He knew the way he was being treated was inhumane and wrong, and he wanted more than anything than to be free and help other people become free as well. So when he was around 20 years old, I should mention he is older than 20 in this image, but when he was around 20 years old, he was able to escape from enslavement. And he had some help from this woman here. This is Anna Murray. Anna was a free woman working in Baltimore City. That's also worth mentioning too, is not every person of African American descent was enslaved. There was a huge free population in Baltimore City specifically as well, Anna being one of those people. So she was never ever enslaved during her lifetime. Now she and Frederick Douglass had met one another in Baltimore. They had fallen in love and decided they were going to leave Maryland and start a new life up in New York. So Frederick Douglass, he had to escape enslavement in order to do this. Anna helped him out by sewing him a sailor's uniform. So while he worked in that shipyard, one day he disguised himself as a sailor. He got on a boat that took him from Maryland up through Delaware, eventually into Pennsylvania. Then around in Pennsylvania, he caught a train that took him all the way up to New York. And he wanted to move to New York because New York at the time was a free state, meaning enslavement had been abolished. So he and Anna were able to go up to New York and start a life together. And doing this was incredibly brave, because if at any point he were caught, if at any point someone figured out he was trying to run away, he would have been sent back to Maryland and re-enslaved, or he would have been sent further south and re-enslaved. Fortunately, nobody stopped him. He was able to meet up with Anna, and a couple weeks later, after they met up in New York together, they were married. And over the course of their marriage together, they had 5 children. They had a daughter named Rosetta, and then they had 3 sons named Louis, Charles, and Frederick Jr., and then they had another daughter, and her name was Anna, so she was named after her mother. And now that Frederick Douglass and Anna Douglass were up in New York, Frederick Douglass was finally free for the very first time in his life. And so with this newfound freedom, he was able to do whatever he wanted. So we talked a little bit about what it meant for a person to be enslaved, but in the chat, tell me, what else does it mean if a person is free? So we've established they can do what they want. Being free means no one is telling them what to do every single day, day in and day out. They are not forced to work for another person. And with whatever job they have, they're now able to be paid for that work. So what Frederick Douglass wanted to do was talk about what it was like to be enslaved and to work against slavery and make sure it was done away with. So in 1845, he published his first autobiography. If you all haven't read any of his autobiographies, I recommend that you do. Go to your local libraries, check them out. They are very powerful and incredible to read. So he published his first book in 1845, and then 2 years later he published the North Star newspaper, and that is in 1847. And the North Star newspaper was an abolitionist newspaper. He published this when he was living up in Rochester, New York. And this newspaper spoke against enslavement, and it talked about why enslavement should be abolished. And so Frederick Douglass, he absolutely was an abolitionist. His home was also used along the Underground Railroad. He also was an incredible orator, meaning he gave a lot of speeches. I also recommend you all look up the "What to the Slave is the 4th of July" speech. Again, it's incredibly powerful, and he asks just that question. He says, well, on the 4th of July, we celebrate freedom and independence, but he also points out that not everybody is able to celebrate that freedom and independence because not everybody is free. So again, look up his speeches, his autobiographies, because they are incredible to read, and we're so fortunate that we have these primary sources to learn about his life. Now, Frederick Douglass, while he was an abolitionist and very outspoken, that did come with some concerns about violence and harm done to him and his family. People threatened him and his wife and his children, so much so that he felt unsafe, and so he decided to travel across the pond. He went to the UK. He left Anna and the children back in the United States, and he gave a lot of speeches over in the UK as well, drumming up support from people internationally to help the United States work towards abolition. When he came back from the UK in 1861, a very important war broke out. That would be the Civil War, which was fought over enslavement and whether we should keep it or abolish it. So the North wanted to abolish or get rid of slavery. The South wanted to keep it. And Frederick Douglass very much sided with the North and was so outspoken that he caught the attention of President Abraham Lincoln, and they had a couple of meetings together where they spoke to one another about what abolition could look like, how it could be done, and Frederick Douglass and President Lincoln, they had a mutual respect for each other. They didn't necessarily always agree on how to free enslaved people, but they absolutely agreed on that needed to be done. So in 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, also another great primary source that we all should go out and read. And the proclamation states that all persons held enslaved in rebellious states, meaning the states that have seceded from the U.S., were officially freed on January 1st, 1863. So it didn't free everybody, and enslavers in the South pretty well ignored the Emancipation Proclamation because they thought they were not part of the United States anymore, and they didn't believe in this proclamation. But this was the first step that Lincoln took to freeing hundreds of thousands of people. This is also coming at a time where African American men were officially allowed to join the United States Army. So Frederick Douglass's sons joined the U.S. Army. I believe this is his son Lewis in his Civil War uniform. So not only did Frederick Douglass inspire and really encourage a president to work towards freedom, he also encouraged his family. So I should mention, his children were fine during the war. They would grow up and have their own families, and there are still descendants of Frederick Douglass living in the DMV area, meaning the DC, Maryland, Virginia area. And Washington, D.C. is where Frederick Douglass spent the rest of his life. So this is his home called Cedar Hill. It's called that because it is on a hill. We can see this kind of curve of the earth. There's a lot of cedars on the property. And this home actually overlooks the U.S. Capitol building. This is a national park site now, so if you all are in the area and it is safe to do so and they're open, I encourage you to go visit Cedar Hill. It is an incredible home and tells you even more about the life of Frederick Douglass. So for the remainder of his life, Frederick Douglass would work as an activist, not only down at the Capitol, but he would also still travel around the country and give speeches working towards equality for everyone. He was very outspoken with the women's suffrage movement. He wanted everybody to have the right to vote, regardless of who you were or what you looked like. Unfortunately, this is the home where his wife, Anna, passed away. And a couple years after she passed away, he remarried a woman named Helen Pitts. And what's notable about their marriage is it was an interracial marriage. Helen Pitts was white. This is coming at a time, too, where those Jim Crow laws were starting to really take effect, and interracial marriages were becoming increasingly illegal. But Frederick Douglass and Helen Pitts Douglass thought that rule was ridiculous, and they married each other anyway because they loved one another. And it's really thanks to Helen that this house is still standing and well preserved. Frederick Douglass passed away in 1895 from a sudden heart attack. And after he passed, she pretty well closed the door, locked it, and said, "This is now a historic site." So again, if you all are in the area and it's open and safe to do so, go visit Cedar Hill because it is incredible to see the home where Frederick Douglass spent the remainder of his days working as an activist. Now, we've gone through quite a bit about his life here, and I want to ask the big "so what" question, because it is 2021 and we're still living through a lot of history, as we all know. So I want you to tell me in the chat, so what? Why is it important we talk about Frederick Douglass today in 2021? So why would it be important today to talk about Frederick Douglass in 2021? While you're thinking about those ideas, before he passed away, Frederick Douglass did have the opportunity to come back to Maryland and to go back to the White House. And he had the opportunity to speak to his enslavers. So he's an adult now, and he went back and he had a conversation with them. So again, we're going to hear from Richard Tillman, and he's going to tell us more about what that conversation was like and how that went. hopefully. Come on, video.
All right, so we're standing on the back porch steps at Wye House.
Uh-oh. We're going to give it a minute to buffer here. But this is, again, descendant of the Lloyd family, whose family had enslaved Frederick Douglass and hundreds of others. And again, the Maryland Center for History and Culture has been fortunate enough to be able to work with Richard Tillman to talk about the life and legacy of Frederick Douglass and how they are still learning about the history of their home, and talk about why it's important to still talk about this history and discuss their family's legacy, as well as Frederick Douglass's. So we're going to see if this is going to play now.
And this is where my great-grandfather, Charles Howard Lloyd, would have greeted Frederick Douglass upon his return to Wye House in 1881. He came by barge up the river to their creek and then walked from there up in front of the orangery and up this, what we call the Bowling Green. Because they used to do lawn bowling there back in the 18th and early 19th century. And so he was greeted here by my great-grandfather. They went up onto the porch and they sat and chatted for about an hour. Unfortunately, the newspaper accounts don't tell you what they talked about because they didn't allow the reporters to come onto the porch or get close enough to hear what they were discussing. The newspaper accounts, I think, said somewhere more than 1,000 people who had assembled out there to see one of the most famous people in the United States at the time, and by far the most famous African American.
So it's a little bit unfortunate we don't know how that conversation went, but I'm sure that was very meaningful to Frederick Douglass to have that private conversation with the people that had once enslaved him. But I know we're running a little low on our time here, so I just want to go over our timeline here, because I did throw out a lot of dates and a lot of historic events, but this kind of gives us a timeline of Frederick Douglass's life and his history. So 1818 was the year he was born in the state of Maryland. When he was 6 to 8 years old, he lived at the Wye House. 1825 was the year he was enslaved in Baltimore. Then 1838 was the year he escaped enslavement, and he posed as a sailor to do so. 1845 was the year his first book was published. He would go on to publish several more books afterward. In 1847, he published the North Star newspaper. Again, that was an abolitionist newspaper. 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which was that first step to freeing people who were enslaved. 1872 was the year Frederick Douglass moved to DC and continued working as an activist. And then finally, he passed away from a heart attack in 1895. So I'm going to leave this timeline up here for a little bit. And I think now we can move on if we're ready for a Q&A. And then I will also bring up the image in a moment where we can take a selfie with Frederick Douglass.
Perfect. Hey, huge thanks, Ashley. This was what a journey to retrace the steps of Frederick. That timeline is pretty staggering to look at and just think of where he started and all the 40-ish years later he's meeting with a president and and all the different things he was able to accomplish in his life from really humble and enslaved beginning. So huge thanks for all of your insight there. One more reminder to everyone: you've got opportunities. Keep your questions coming. We've got some great ones. So Ashley gets you're on the hot seat here in just a second. Before we do that, like Ashley mentioned, we do want to give everybody an opportunity to take a photo with Frederick Douglass. I think he would have wanted it that way. So we're going to get that up in just a second. While you get your cameras ready, I want to let you know what the prize is. If you upload it to Instagram, we'll have the handles up on the way out and tag Varsity Tutors and the Maryland Center for History and Culture. You'll be entered to win a book about African American leaders of Maryland, straight from Ashley's museum there, which is great. We'll have a photo of that up on the way out. And, as Frederick Douglass mentioned, education and reading were really the key to, to his success and ability to transcend his beginnings. So in addition to that book, you'll also be able to win 1 year of a VT Plus subscription, where you can take classes on any and all topics from history to science, technology, and even kind of fun things, learning crafts and all that. So we'll have more information about that on the way out. Hopefully this has given everyone an opportunity to get your questions in, because we're going to hit those right after this picture and get that camera up. And so with that, let me turn it back to you, Ashley. And if you want to tell us what we're taking a photo with, we'll make sure everybody gets those shots.
So one of my favorite Frederick Douglass facts is he is the most photographed person of the 19th century, meaning there are more pictures of Frederick Douglass than there are of people like Abraham Lincoln or Clara Barton. So take your selfie with Frederick Douglass. I'm going to pop out of the way here so you can. And just know you're taking a photo with the most photographed person of the 19th century. Give you a few more seconds. Get those selfies in. And with the Q&A, I am more than happy to answer any questions you might still have about the life of Frederick Douglass. I'm also happy to answer any questions you might have about Maryland history in general, or if you want to know about my job and what it's like to work in a museum, I am also happy to answer any of those questions. So I'm going to pop back on screen, and whenever you're ready.
Perfect. Thank you. We'll hit all of the above. Actually, I didn't know that about most photographed person of the 1800s. So hopefully we get them a nice jump in the rankings for the 2000s as well. That was really cool. Thank you for that. So okay, we've got questions across the gamut, and again, keep getting them in, everyone. And huge thanks to everyone for all of your participation. Ashley, I think the first one is you mentioned that one of the reasons that Black History Month is in February is Frederick Douglass's birthday. Are there any others or other reasons that February was chosen?
Yeah, it's Lincoln's birth month as well. So, and as we know, he worked towards freeing enslaved people. So his birthday is February 12th, which is also why Black History Month is in February. And then several other activists have also been born in February as well. So there's a lot of connections there. So that's another reason why we celebrate Black History Month in February.
Awesome, thank you. That's that meeting between Douglass and Lincoln was pretty transformative, and so it's great that we get to honor both of them and their contributions this month. We get a President's Day out of it too. So we'll go kind of back in chronology, and you mentioned that one of the transformative things for Frederick Douglass was that he was Mrs. Auld, right? Was allowed him to learn to read. Why was teaching slaves to read so frowned upon, and why was that such a kind of controversial thing in her family to allow him to do?
So I might flip that question to everyone in the chat. So why do you think it was frowned upon for enslaved people to have an education? So give us a couple seconds to think about that, type that in. So like I said, in Maryland, it was not technically illegal. In other states, it was illegal for enslaved people to learn how to read and write. And that's because, like I said, with education, there's a lot of power with that. So if enslaved people learn how to read and write, they could also start reading laws. They could also start working to abolish those laws or amend those laws against enslavement. So this is a way to kind of disenfranchise people and really make sure there's that imbalance of power. So that's why enslaved people were not allowed an education. That's why Hugh Auld, the person who owned Frederick Douglass as a little boy, he was furious with his wife because she was teaching someone how to read and write. who was enslaved.
That's really powerful. Knowledge really is power, and the fact that that one of the pillars of keeping people enslaved was to deprive them of education. I think should hopefully get all of us. Even on the days we don't love doing our homework, don't love that there's a quiz coming up on Thursday. Education really is a gift and power. So I'm glad you mentioned that. Also, you're obviously definitely a teacher if you pose that question back to everyone else. So embrace that education, and huge thanks, Ashley, for conveying that to so many kids. I think education really is power. And Frederick Douglass totally exemplifies that. So we had a lot of other questions. And one thing I'll mention, you were really good at I'd see questions come in and write them down, and then 5 minutes later, Ashley already answered it. And so good work getting ahead of it. One I'm going to come back to though is so a lot of people wanted to know about your favorite things about Frederick Douglass. You mentioned one of the favorite facts being how often he was photographed. But are there any other sort of famous quotes of Frederick Douglass's or experiences or accomplishments of his that really stand out to you?
Oh gosh, that's such a big question, because he is one of my favorite historic figures to talk about. One of my other favorite things is he worked towards voting rights for African American men and women. And he wanted women to have the right to vote. He wanted everybody to have the right to vote, because he also knew how important that was to be able to have that voice in our country and in our democracy, and have that say about what changes you want to see in your world. So he very much was an advocate for equal rights in terms of voting, which I really, really love. And unfortunately, he passed away before he could see women get the right to vote, but he was at the Seneca Falls Convention, which is when leaders like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, I don't know if Alice Paul was there, that might have been a little bit before her time, but several activists got together and sat down and said, hey, we need to work towards women's voting rights, and he was one of the few men who were there advocating for that as well.
Renaissance man, that's really amazing. I think one of the cool things, we've got Women's History Month coming up a month from now in March, and one of the amazing not even parallels, like direct connections between the abolitionist movement growing into the women's suffrage movement is you've given folks quite a bit of a reading list and things to research, and that's another one that is definitely fascinating to get into. So you mentioned all historical topics are fair game, and Maryland and Baltimore in particular are really interesting, and a few people were asking, wait a second, how did that work, that you could have within Baltimore there were freed African Americans, there were slaves. Can you tell us a little bit about Maryland's role in sort of how did that work there? What was Maryland's role in the Civil War? I know was a little bit of kind of a gray area. Tell us sort of experience of Maryland.
Maryland is such an interesting state to look at, especially in the 19th century, because it was still technically part of the Union during the Civil War, meaning it was still part of the North, but people were very, very divided regarding enslavement and whether to keep it or abolish it. And so in Maryland and in several other states that had enslavement too, not every single person who was African American was enslaved, which is important to remember. But in Maryland, like I said, there was a massive population of free people living in the state, as well as a massive population that was enslaved. So we're seeing this divide in just the state of Maryland, where people were like, abolish slavery or keep slavery. Now, when it came to emancipation, Maryland was not included with the Emancipation Proclamation. So like I said, the Emancipation Proclamation states that all persons held enslaved in the rebellious states only were freed, meaning those are the states who outwardly said, we're breaking away from the U.S. It started with South Carolina, and those states were not referred to as the Confederacy by Lincoln. They were the states in rebellion. So the Emancipation Proclamation said that the people held enslaved there were freed, but since Maryland, Kentucky, what would become West Virginia, Missouri, and Delaware, they were called border states. Since those states were still part of the Union but held enslaved people, the emancipation didn't count towards those states. So it would take several more years for those states to abolish enslavement. So it'd still be a while for Maryland to free enslaved people. It didn't happen in 1863. So that is a very complicated moment in U.S. history. I've hopefully explained it well. Let me know if you have more questions about that.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, it's the border states and Maryland in particular, so, such proximity to the capital, all those things is a fascinating spot to think about. So, we'll if you do have follow-up questions and we don't get to them here, we'll have information for how to visit the Maryland Center for History and Culture, on our way out as well. And even if you're not from Maryland, just a fascinating spot to research for all of its contributions to an interesting role in American history. All right, and then because you said all questions are fair game, we always end up with sort of a career day finale to these. A lot of people are asking about you posted out there the kind of so what, why do we study Frederick Douglass, history in general. You've kind of dedicated a lot of your time and talents to making sure people understand history. So can you tell us a little bit about kind of a two-part question to sort of package together all people have been asking about you and your job. What do you think is so important about learning history, and why is that such a passion for you? And what are your favorite things about your job and advice to people who also think it might be fun someday?
Yeah, so I should give a little background about myself. So I am not a Maryland native. I am from the state of Wyoming, got my bachelor's degree from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and then I got my master's degree in public history from American University in Washington, D.C. So I have loved history and social studies since probably, I'm going to say, around the 4th grade. And that love just kind of stuck with me, and I decided to make a career out of it. And I especially love history and studying history because you need to know about your past in order to understand the present. And especially when we're talking about Frederick Douglass, because he was working towards equality, and this is something that we can see we are still working towards in our nation. I especially think about like the Black Lives Matter movement this summer. So we're seeing these same themes happening over and over and over again that Frederick Douglass was working towards roughly 200 years ago. So it's super important to understand our past, to understand our present, and then to look towards the future and see how we can make the world an even better place. Was that the two parts? Did I get them?
Got it. Perfect. Thanks a ton. And yeah, totally agree. I think the, programs like this are great to kind of, get people thinking in terms of, big figures in history and eras in history, and, ultimately to understand why things are the way they are. We take so much of that for granted, and you start to unravel it back to its roots and realize that, like you mentioned so eloquently, we're living through history right now. So as you see the cause and effect relationship of actions that Frederick Douglass took, or, other civil rights leaders that, throughout this month we'll be doing, Black History Month programming here, as you kind of see inspiration in those, realize they're not just people in textbooks. There are people who were, in seats like yours, maybe not learning on Zoom in Frederick Douglass's day, but learning out of books and seeing opportunities to understand their world and change it. So, Ashley, huge thanks. I know, for everyone on the East Coast, a lot of people have a snow day, and so it's probably a little bit of a fight to get into work today and all that. Huge thanks for all that you taught us, all that you inspired, and hopefully giving folks some things to do the next couple days and beyond to research, whether they read Frederick Douglass's autobiography. Definitely the what is the 4th of July to a slave speech is amazing, and on all the other things you pointed out. So as promised here on the way out, we're going to give everyone the instructions to win the contest with your photos. We'll look forward to seeing those up online. Before I do that, Ashley, any closing thoughts? And if you want to give a little bit of a plug, I know you're going to be back, I think, next month for more history programming. So you want to make sure people know where to find you there.
Yeah, I'm going to switch my screen here real quick so I can show you some information from our site here. So again, we're the Maryland Center for History and Culture. We actually are open, so if I have any Marylanders who want to kill some time when it's not a crazy snow day, come visit us. This is our location. If you want to know more, to check out our website. Like I said, we recently rebranded, which means we got a new website, which is really, really nice to check out. So I encourage you to go look at our website, learn more about us. If you're an educator out there, I do virtual field trips as my job. So if you would like me to visit your classroom or have your classes check in remotely from their homes, we can absolutely do a virtual field trip. You can, again, find us on our website or give us a call if you want to know more. I would love to see your students. And yeah, I will see you all next month for our national anthem program. So we're going to talk about what makes a national anthem.
Perfect. Well, we're looking forward to it as well. So huge thanks again, Ashley. As promised, here's the information to get your photos up and attempt to win the contest. We'll see the Maryland Center for History and Culture here back next month for, as Ashley mentioned, a national anthems program, which will be fascinating. Talking to her about that was really interesting. And if you're interested in more Black history, we've got classes even starting, as soon as tomorrow. We're going to be going through the roots of even the origins of slavery and that whole experience. So come join us, and we'll see you back for plenty of programming here soon. And on the way out, we'll show you the contest rules to win. So thanks everyone, and we'll see you back soon.